Hello, welcome to the EUPATI guidance webinar for patient involvement in the ethical review of clinical trials. We are going to start. A lot of people are joining at the moment. We are going to start in 5 minutes. I will, however, start introducing the people participating in this webinar. The presenter will be Ingrid Klingmann from the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice. She is a physician specialized in general medicine, clinical pharmacology, and pharmaceutical medicine with over 30 years of experience in many roles in pharmaceutical companies, academic sites, and she has focused on clinical trial management and ethical and regulatory aspects. She is the chair of the board of the European Forum for Good Clinical Practice, and she also wrote the ethics guidance text for EUPATI, so she is the given presenter for this topic. Then we have two panelists, Andrea Heckenberg from the University of Vienna. She has been a medical physicist in nuclear medicine, and she worked as editor of a medical journal, and since 2010 she is a senior staff member of the Ethics Committee Office at the Vienna Medical University. She is supporting the Ethics Committee chair on project-related and administrative issues, and she is in charge of the assessment of the informed consent forms. The second panelist is Giulio Maria Corbelli from Italy. He is a member of the European AIDS Treatment Group, the chair of the European Community Advisory Board, which is a working group at the EATG, and he is also a member of the Ethics Committee of the National Institute for Infectious Diseases in Italy. He works as a freelance journalist for magazines and websites. Finally, you have me moderating. My name is David Harry. I am also from the European AIDS Treatment Group. In the EUPATI project, I co-led Work Package 7, which had the oversight over the guidance's production. And before we start, I already point at the next two guidances webinars. The next one will be on involvement in regulatory affairs, Tuesday, June 20, and the last one will be on involvement in health technology assessment processes, which will be on Wednesday, July 5. And I see a lot of people have joined now. You should type your questions as they occur. And we have, during the presentation, planned stops for these questions. If there are no questions, we will continue. If there are questions at these stops, I will ask them to the panel. So much for now, and now I would like to invite Ingrid to start her presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Thank you very much for the kind introduction and for setting so nicely the frame. And I'm delighted to see so many people participating in this webinar. Because it is a very special area. I think the interest on one hand to make that work and more intensively work, that patients get involved in ethics committees, the interest is there. But we have also seen in the preparation of this guidance that there is certainly much more debate on how to do that than in some other areas that we have been working on. So what I would like now to do is give you a short introduction into why we have that guidance, the process that we followed to get what we have now, and then go with you through the ethical review guidance step by step. I will stop my presentations quite frequently and wait for your questions, because if we go, the alternative would be that we go through the whole document and then have a discussion at the end, but I'm afraid there are so many details on which we discussed and to which we give recommendations that it would be quite difficult to remember everything. You have the guidance document received when you registered, but you can also load them down in the handouts, but I will present the document here also on the screen after the presentation so that we can go through that step by step. And then, of course, we have at the end, hopefully, still time for either discussions on some points that David needed to stop in the discussion because we needed to make sure that we get to all points before the end of our 90 minutes. Or you come with additional ideas, additional suggestions that we should look at, and that is the other very important thing, we need still lots of practical experience on how to make that involvement of patients in the ethical review work more efficiently, more broadly. And so every idea that you have, every suggestion is highly welcome, because as you all know, UParty goes on. We are now an EPF project under the leadership of EPF. We continue in our work, and the implementation of the guidances is certainly a very important aspect that we will continue to work on. So as you have, those who have been in the guidance webinar last time have already seen that slide here, but we decided when we prepared the guidances that we should have a general introduction into the issues of guidance, issuing of guidance over all 4 guidance documents. So I would like to briefly repeat that here. We have patients and patient organizations that have been involved more widely, to include them into early and post-approval stages in the medicines development process, but and not only confined to clinical development. We really want to have the patients involved in the overall development and life cycle process of medicines. The overarching guidance on meaningful and ethical interaction is missing in most of these areas, however, especially in R&D, and there is a lot of insecurity which partly has been solved or tackled by with some codes and regulations, but they are mostly general legal and ethical content about collaboration, communication, funding, but more on in very general terms. We try here to be much more specific. So concrete recommendations facilitate the collaboration, we think, between the different stakeholders, and we have been told many times that this is exactly what it needs and what we need to work towards. Now, as we have mentioned last time already, we have these 4 guidances produced within Work Package 7 of UParty. So the patient involvement in industry-led R&D, in HTA, in regulatory processes, and also in the ethics committees. We have produced these guidances within Work Package 7, then had a large consultation within the UParty stakeholder organizations internally very broadly, and then once we had that information built in, or these comments built in, we also went out and disseminated our guidances to all possible people we could have in our joint databases, and got also quite a lot of feedback, which was then discussed. Some of the things were quite obvious and could easily be changed or amended, and other points really required lots of discussions, which we then had internally and decided then ultimately on the document that you are now having in front of you. So the UParty guidance for patient involvement in ethical review talks about the involvement of patients' experience in ethics committees. And the interesting thing is that while the industry side, or let's say the guidance on industry, there is a quite strong balance between industry proposing to have patients involved meanwhile and patients offering to participate. Here on the ethical side, we have more offerings, so to say, from the patient side, that they have an important contribution to make, and also patient organizations are involving more and more in offering this as an important aspect of improving the protection of trial subjects that is provided by ethics committees. So really a support to the ethics committees by offering whatever they have as knowledge, as experience, and ideas to improve that process. In reality, however, this engagement is not occurring in most European countries. As first of all, in most national legislations, this is not foreseen. And in those where it is foreseen, it is done in a quite vague way. And that is partly also because on the ethics committee side, there is quite a lot of hesitation whether it's in principle a good thing to include patients into the committee. And one strong argument is that ethics committees make very strong efforts to develop a group of competent people who are unbiased, objective, see the project from the distance, and can give as objective advice as possible. Bringing in a patient or patient representative means to bring in a concerned party into this neutral body. And this would require, and this requires really a type of paradigm shift, first in the interaction of the ethics committee members, but also in the way how the advice from ethics committees is generated. Let's be clear, ethics committees in most countries are not approving a clinical trial, but they are giving advice to the physicians whether this project is ethically acceptable and it's justifiable for the physician to do this type of research in human beings, in patients. Ethics committees do not reliably experience competent input into their discussions in those cases where they try that out. We have ethics committees who say, yes, we have a patient representative, but it's more, yeah, let's say an alibi function. The patient is there, but we do not get the comprehensive contributions that we would expect as an so to say an adding factor, a strong adding factor to the way how we come to our conclusions. It's also so that the expectations of the ethics committees vary. So we have ethics committees that really just look for input from patients into the patient information sheet and informed consent. And another point that was mentioned several times for us, and that I did not mention before, we had before we came up with these guidance, we had a workshop on that, we had a webinar on that, we had different teleconferences with quite a lot of people. So all the things that, all the information that we gathered also told us that in fact it's very difficult to find interested patients and knowledgeable patients who would be willing to participate in the work of an ethics committee. So it's a really complex situation that needs discussion on many different levels. All stakeholders, however, and that was the interesting thing, agree that patient involvement in clinical trials should occur much earlier than in the ethics committee review. They claim, or many said, that the ethically relevant input should really occur as early as in the conceptual phase of protocol development, because that is the moment when the benefit risk assessment needs to be done for the first time. What type of drug is acceptable for patients? What doses are acceptable? What are acceptable comparators? What about placebo? Is double-blind acceptable, etc.? So the conceptual phase of the protocol is the moment where a lot of ethical decisions are made and where patient input can be extremely helpful. But then all along the preparation of the protocol, when the details are defined, how often do the patients have to come, how many assessments have to be done per day, how much blood has to be withdrawn, what therapeutic options are there for the patients in addition to the medication, that the test medication, etc. So there are many aspects in the protocol development that have an ethical importance and where patient involvement can be extremely helpful. And then, of course, what most people think when they think about patient involvement, that is the patient information sheet and other documents like the diary or so that patients receive in clinical trials. So therefore, we have come to the conclusion that, in fact, this guidance will cover patient involvement in all these steps, although, of course, we put special emphasis on the involvement of patients in research ethics committees, but we really want to make sure that we have this holistic approach in the overall document. And you have, when you have followed UPATI, you have probably seen this slide several times. This is a very nice presentation from Jan and colleagues to show where patients can contribute from the trial concept phase until the end of the trial, and we will go through these different phases because we use this as the, so to say, the bone, the red line for our guidance to give practical advices what to do in these different phases. So that is my introduction here, and before I go into the project into the guidance document as such, I would like to give the floor back to you, David, to see whether there are any questions and whether you would like first to have an opportunity to answer questions.
No questions. Continue.
No questions. Okay, then I will look into the guidance document, guidance document. So this is it. I just will reviews here so that I hope you can all see my screen. Is that working?
Yes. Okay.
Okay, good. So this is how it looks like, and I mentioned already several aspects of the introduction, but I would like to put one emphasis on this part here, and this is the values that we recognized in this guidance, but also in the other 3 guidances that we have developed, and that is on one hand the relevance of patients' knowledge, perspectives, and experience, that they are unique and contribute to ethical deliberations. So we think this is really an important thing that we should all be aware and acknowledge. Important is also the fairness, that patients have the same rights to contribute to the ethical review of clinical trials as other stakeholders. And when I come later to the practical let's say conditions for involvement of patients in the ethical review process, in the work of ethics committees, this is an important aspect. Also the value of equity, that patient involvement in the ethical review process contributes to an equity by seeking to understand the diverse needs of patients with particular health issues, and that these are really balanced against the requirements of the industry, or let's say of the sponsor, whether this is an academic or a commercial sponsor. And last but not least, the issue of capacity building, because patient involvement processes address barriers to involving patients in ethical review, and build capacity for patient and ethics committees to work together is absolutely important. And if we start working on this now in a comprehensive way, then I'm pretty sure we will be able to make quite big progress in a relatively short period of time, because people will realize very quickly how beneficial that is if we support and facilitate this interaction. So you have the usual disclaimer here in the guidance, and the introduction to patient involvement in ethical review I gave you already in my presentation. So what I would like to focus here is that the introduction talks about patient centricity and how much that is done now on the industry side, how much industry and also industry works on improving that. But in fact, it also plays really an important role when we talk about, the involvement of patients into this. So patient involvement in R&D is more and more accepted, but ethics committees are expert advisory groups providing advice on the ethical acceptability, as I mentioned. So to fulfill these obligations, ethics committee members need to be independent, neutral, objective, and competent in scientific, ethical, methodological topics. We have in all legislations already lay members who are in ethics committees, providing, let's say, a neutral, distant aspect from the lay perspective. But now, with the idea of getting patients, so concerned parties, to the table, we really go for a paradigm shift, and ultimately we need to see how this can be made to the best advantage of all parties involved. It means also that in the ethical review we need to think about how best to apply the concept of patient centricity, and how we can enable patients to provide valuable input. So therefore we need these guidances and need to continue to work on general guidances and very concrete guidances for that interaction. So this is the slide that you have, the picture that you have practically already seen. Now, very important for the next part of or the core part of this guidance is the definition of patients. And those who have been in the webinar last time have heard Kay presenting that, because also for the industry interaction, it is important what type of patients really should participating, and this is also very important now here for the topic that we have concerning ethical review in this webinar. Therefore, I would like to quickly repeat for those who were there last time and introduce for those who are for the first time in our webinar what we mean with different type of patients. We use the term patient all in different perspectives and have different things in mind, and therefore UPATI made a very strong effort, especially Work Package 7, to come here to an agreed terminology. So on one hand, we have the individual patients, and these are persons with personal experience of living with a disease. They may or may not have technical knowledge in R&D or regulatory processes, but their main role is really to contribute with their subjective disease and treatment experience. So here, subjectivity is expected because it's really, it's me, it's my disease, I know what it means to live with it, and I know what I would like to have changed. Closely related to that is, of course, carers. We should not forget the carers, because these are persons supporting the individual patients, such as a family member, as well as paid or volunteer helpers. It must not only be family members. That's especially for those patients who cannot, so to say, speak for themselves. Either they are too young or they are whatever way handicapped. So that a carer who knows what it means for that patient to live with a disease can speak also from the perspective of the patient and from the perspective of a carer who has this burden to deal with in life. Then we have what we call patient advocates. These are persons who have the insight and experience in supporting a larger population of patients living with this specific disease. These are people who may or may not be affiliated with an organization, but they know what it means to live with a disease. They know quite a lot of people. They know quite a bit about the disease and can represent that patient population. We should make a difference between patient advocates and patient organizational representatives, because patient organizational representatives are persons who are mandated to represent and express the collective view of patients, of a patient organization on a specific issue or disease area. They may not be sick themselves. This may be people who work in the patient organization, who gather a lot of information about living with a disease, about the needs of patients with a disease through the work that they are doing in the patient organization. And then last but not least, especially very much promoted by UPATI, is the category of what we call patient experts. And these are patients who, in addition to patients or patient organization representatives, who in addition to disease-specific expertise have the technical knowledge in R&D and or regulatory affairs through training, for example, in the UPATI course, or through experience that they have gained over the years in different functions. For example, of course, our UPATI fellows, where we trained 100 so far, and another 60 will start in autumn. They have been trained by UPATI on the full spectrum of medicines R&D, so they have really the broader picture. So keep these different categories in mind, please, when we talk about or when I present to you our recommendations, because you may think differently about that. So we have the individual patients, we have the carers, then we have the patient advocates, the patient organization representatives, and the patient experts. So are there any questions so far?
Yes, I have got a few. Question number one, are there positive examples of patient engagement in ethical committees in any country? Andrea and Giulio, would you be able to reply to this? Maybe Andrea first and then Giulio.
Yeah, good afternoon. I think I will hand this very quickly over to Giulio, because we, as Ingrid has mentioned, it's different in every country. We do have by law requested the involvement of a person representing patients in the ethics committee, but our solution for the time being is we have people from a organization that supports patients or people, citizens in all their needs related to the healthcare sector. So if people have problems with a hospital, or if people want to enter a clinical trial, for instance, etc., etc. But those people are not actually patients. But I think Giulio has more pertinent information here.
Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, I can start from my personal experience and then trying to add some consideration, general considerations. From my own experience, when I joined the ethics committee at the National Institute of Infectious Diseases here in Italy, in Rome, some years ago, I think 3 years ago, there was no patient representative, no active patient representative before me, so they were not kind of prepared to receive inputs from the patients. But we started working together in a very effective way, I should say. The important thing there is that there is no answer to the question at the general level, because even in Italy, where the patient representatives are usually included in the ethics committees, it is not always the case that they can provide some very useful contribution to the work. So it all depends on the preparedness, of course, knowledgeability of the patient representative, on how available he or she is, because working in an effective way at an ethics committee also requires some time. Some time must be spent to study all the documents and so on. But I know from my personal experience, but also from experiences from other colleagues in France, for example, or in other countries, that when the patient representative is knowledgeable and is able to contribute to the discussion, there is a huge benefit for the in general. So there are a lot of anecdotal, so to say, positive experiences in this sense. What we are trying to do, I think, in my opinion, also with this guidance, is to try and collect these best practices to facilitate further dissemination of these practices, and to try and share them with those in those environments where the patients are not fully involved in the ethics review.
Thank you. The next question has two sides, actually. It's a double-sided one. How important is it for the patient to have disease knowledge about the ethical review ongoing? And the second part of the same question, can it be an advantage that the patient doing the review has no experience in the specific disease area? Who wants to answer that one?
Can you clarify the question a bit, David? Sorry, I'm not sure I get the point.
The question is, how important is it for the patient to have disease-specific know-how when he is involved in the ethical review?
Okay.
And the second part of the question is, can it be an advantage that the patient involved in the review has no experience in the disease area?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, if I may start, is that okay?
Yes, please.
Well, I would say it depends. Both can be an advantage. If you, for instance, disease knowledge is probably, if there's a question like how risk and burden is the patient, would a participant be willing to take in a clinical trial, then it's probably best to ask those who live with the disease, and because they can judge best how much additional risk and burden they would be willing to accept. On the other hand, there are certainly some cases when it's better to be more objective and not to have the disease. I think it depends very much on the actual question, because not living with the disease would maybe bring a more objective view, a less emotional view that could in some questions also be very beneficial.
Julio?
Yes, if I may add to that, I agree with Andrea, of course. On the other hand, I think that the ethics review is a group work. Everybody contribute to that. So the ethics committee usually have representatives from physicians, statisticians, ethics experts, and so on. There are many different areas covered in the membership of an ethics committee. I think that the emotional aspects, which can be viewed as a lack of objectiveness somehow in the discussion, can in any case add some information to the discussion, as other members will bring more objective points of view. So in general, I would say that having a direct knowledge of the disease is always an advantage. Is always something that can bring some more information into the discussion. Anyhow, I don't think that a lack of knowledge or experience with the disease, or personal experience of a disease, is a barrier to be involved in the discussion, because many mechanisms, many situations can be shared across disease areas, understanding what are the best choices for participants in clinical research.
What could be added maybe is that a patient sitting on an ethics committee has to understand his role, that he has to bring in the experience from the patient side in a very general way. Would you agree with that?
Definitely, yes. But going beyond the personal perspective is something crucial for engaging in a useful and effective discussion within the ethics review.
Okay, thank you. So I have more questions, but Ingrid, continue for the time being.
Okay, just perhaps also one comment from my end. I think it is very important that we understand that, yes, ethics committee members have their own professional background. They come in because they are clinical pharmacologists, or they are pharmacists, or they are nurse, or whatever. So they come with their professional background and see the world from their perspective. But I think even those who are able to put themselves very much into patient shoes, it is still different if you are a patient, and even if it's a patient with a different disease, but experiencing the fact that the body and the mind are not doing as you want them, that there is a hurdle, a problem that you have to deal and live with, is a very special experience by itself. And I think already, whatever the indication is, this is a fundamental experience that somebody who is a patient can bring in. Of course, quite a number of people sitting in ethics committees are also patients. And in my experience, it's always then particularly interesting when people start to switch their hats and start to argue from their experience as a patient. But still, of course, a patient who has these two heads, who has also the other side, is in the experience of the other side, is still seeing things somewhat different than somebody who is not expert in any of the other professions, but brings in the personal experience of living with a disease. So I think it's really important to understand that this is per se an expertise that is very helpful, whatever the area of indication is. Now, let's be clear, and this was also one of the key things that we tried to figure out in this guidance. At the time of the ethical review by the ethics committee, the protocol details have been decided. Those who are familiar with the protocol development process know that the ethics committee sees the protocol when the sponsor thinks, okay, this is it. This is the way how I want to perform the trial. This is the way how it will most probably work. That is the way I would like to do it. And then the ethics committee reviews that and says, yes, that seems to be okay, that is fine, or no, for whatever reason, this cannot work, or we cannot accept that, or please reconsider this or that. So it is really a review of a document where a large group of people has come to the decision, this is doable, this is good, this is what we want to do. So at that time comes then the patient in who participates in an ethical review, and this means he can or she can only review and contribute to the things that the ethics committee can really at that stage still impact. And that are things, of course, like the benefit-risk balance in principle, but also the burden, but also especially then the site-specific aspects, now whether the site is convenient, suitable, whether the expertise of the investigator and his team seems so good that they can be trusted to do this type of research. It's the informed consent, it's the insurance, so it's the conditions for the trial more than the general fundamental aspects. There are in fact very few protocols where an ethics committee generally rejects the performance of the trial because it is considered to be unethical. And I think, Andrea, you will agree with me that only a very small number of studies is really rejected as such, where this principal discussion about benefits and risk is playing the dominant role in the discussion of the ethics committee. So, yes, please, Andrea, go ahead.
Yes, I agree with you, Ingrid. This is indeed the case, but I would like to add that sometimes there are occasions when the ethics committee really rejects a study, does not agree with a study protocol, and I think in this case it would be especially valuable for the ethics committee to have support of the patient population as well, because this is a very of course, this is not a nice thing to do, and it usually brings along a lot of discussion. And so having support from the patient community also on this decision would be extremely beneficial. It does happen. So other things the ethics committee can do sometimes is if the protocol is not satisfactory, other than opting out, is also at least to demand a data safety monitoring board, interim analysis, things like that. But there are some things that can be done. But I do agree the protocol should be and is usually ready at the time it reaches the ethics committee.
David, that reminds me of the discussion that we had in Basel at this webinar, at this workshop with the ethics committees of the Swiss ethics committees, where we also had patient representatives in the room, and where we discussed individual projects, difficult cases, and where there was a very lively debate about whether the study should be accepted or not, and where patients and the ethics committee members had diametrically different opinions. So I think these are probably the hot debate moments where the patient input is really of yeah, very, very high importance. David, do you want to come in here for a moment, or?
I think in the interest of time, I don't want to go there.
Okay, good.
I get many questions,
Okay.
but perhaps Julio wants to respond.
Julio?
No. I have no special
okay.
thought about that.
So then perhaps we take that then when we come to that point in more detail. So I would just like to mention briefly the hurdles, why it is not happening in so far. And this is really manifold, and we should be aware of that. It's not only that there is no political will or that ethics committees do not want this. There are really practical technical problems. It's difficult to find patients willing to contribute to the ethical review for ethics committees physically. No, this is the case across Europe. All ethics committees who have started to work in this tell this, that it would require a type of matchmaking opportunity, and we come to that later. involving patients with specific disease can be really logistically challenging when you see that an ethics committee has to review 15, 20 trials in one day, in one session. Then to bring in 15 or 20 patient representatives from different, or patient experts from different indications can be very, very difficult to organize, because it's also very difficult to predict how much time the ethics committee will need for an individual project. And there is also disagreement about how far patients with a particular disease can and want to be representative for other patients with a disease. No, you have one patient in the room as an ethics committee, but how representative is this patient? And also other patients may not feel too comfortable that this patient is now representing their views. So there is, from the patient community, not any type of agreed wishes, so to say, or recommendations for that type of support that patients can give to ethics committees. So there is still also quite a lot of work to be done. And there is still all over Europe a lack of capacity for suitable patients that can play that role. So far, we have only a limited number of patient organizations who make really an effort to identify and educate individual members for a role with relevant contributions in ethical review, and specifically in an ethics committee. So there's also tasks for the patient organizations to figure out whether they want to participate in an ethical review or in ethical review in principle, and then how to organize themselves to generate that expertise and this agreement on what the content of this advice should be. And I think this is a major task that ethics committees really, that patient organizations still have to do. I would like to stop here for a moment. Are there any questions or comments on that?
I got a few more questions. One is coming from Russia, and the person asks if we foresee any activities to promote patient engagement in ethical committees. What is UPATI doing?
Well, altogether, I think we are certainly promoting patient engagement in all these areas. What UPATI is primarily doing and will continue to do is educating patients. Our primary objective is really, we are the European Patients Academy on Therapeutic Innovation. That means we educate patients to fulfill their different roles. We are not primarily let's say a lobbying organization for patient engagement. We are indirectly, of course, doing that, and through our UPATI national platforms, we created the ground, so to say, for having these discussions and for promoting these engaged activity, or this engagement activity. But our primary focus is really on reaching as many patients as possible and to give them an opportunity to educate themselves to find their own way and their role for those contributions.
Thank you. Then I have another question, an interesting one. Is it possible that an ethics committee accepts a clinical trial that is unacceptable for patient advocates and patient experts?
Okay.
Andrea first.
Well, that will. I can. First of all, I don't really imagine that would happen, because the ethics committee is per definition there to protect the rights and the autonomy and the safety of the patient. So I do not. I think it's hardly thinkable that an ethics committee would accept a trial where the patient representative says, I cannot accept it. Of course, it's very important to have a patient who really is knowledgeable in this. I mean, you cannot obviously have a patient who just for emotional.
Andrea?
Sorry, am I back?
Now you're back.
Yeah, sorry about that. I don't think reasonable arguments from a patient representative would be ignored. I don't think that would happen. Also, like Ingrid said, you will hardly have a clinical trial that reaches the ethics committee that is not acceptable. Usually they have slight amendments will have to be made, but I cannot really imagine that would happen.
Giulio, how do you see the issue?
Yeah, yes, I agree with Andrea. Of course, every time I have something to object to our clinical trial procedure at the ethics committee, at least I get some feedback from other members, so we can ask for clarification or for some changes in the trial. But I can think I'm thinking of a situation we had recently about a large international HIV prevention trial, which is going on in Europe also. And this trial was very controversial because a large part of the HIV community thought it was unethical or at least conducted in a not acceptable way. It was a part of the community. So, of course, when we are representing the patient community, in any case, including the ethical review committees, it is not easy to summarize all the positions that can be present within a community. There can be different positions, and in this case, a part of the community was quite skeptical, so to say, about this trial. So what we can do there is to try and put in place all the efforts of or the actions that can improve the quality of the trial. But in any case, I agree that it is very, very rare that something which is not acceptable for patients as a whole community, patient community as a whole, will be conducted in practice in our centers.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions, but let's continue with the presentation now.
Okay, so the next part of the guidance tries to structure a bit the situation and where patient engagement can occur in the ethical review altogether. So the first part is the trial concept phase, where patient expert can advise really on the research question that should be asked, on the outcomes, on the objectives of the trial, of the objectives first, and then which primary endpoints, which parameters should be used, what are the comparators, what the duration of the treatment, etc. The in- and exclusion criteria of the patients or the trial participants. These are the quality of life aspects, for example, or patient-reported outcomes, whether what type of assessment should be made, what makes sense, what is relevant for patients. So in this trial concept phase, we recommend in UPATI, after internal discussions, collecting the information through all the different channels that I mentioned, and there was quite a large, let's say, agreement from all sides that for this work, it would be the best to have patient experts who really understand the patient, the medicine's development process, who know and understand about the problems, methodological problems that sponsors, academic or commercial sponsors face from an organizational, managerial, financial point of view. There are many scientific aspects that are really hurdles or problems that need to be overcome. So it's and this type of discussion or this interaction requires a mutual understanding, using the same terminology and being able to argue on eye level. So patient experts are seen as the most appropriate contributors to the trial concept phase. The next one is then the trial design phase, when the details of the trials are decided. So, for example, how can a suitable number of participants be recruited? What needs to be the details of the in- and exclusion criteria? In what countries to go? To what community to go? How to define the details then of the protocol? Of course, here it's important to think about the benefits of the trial, because the benefits and also the risks lie very much in the details, so how to balance that, but also not to forget the burden to participants, whether this is acceptable. altogether whether the care that is provided to the participants during the trial is adequate, also whether the trial medication is easy and reliable to handle and is really user-friendly, so to say, whether the measurements and assessments are acceptable, a too big burden, a too big annoyance, altogether acceptable for the participants or not. But also aspects like whether patients will at the end be informed of the trial results. For example, if the study is stopped early, how to handle that process, and also how to provide the information afterwards to patients about the overall outcome of the trial. These are discussions where it is really helpful if this is done by someone who understands really the methodology, who understands the issues as well here, and therefore we recommend that also in that phase, in the trial design phase, patient experts get included by the sponsor, academic or commercial sponsor, into these type of discussions. And in this way to support the acceptability of the trial conditions for participants and the relevance of its outcome for the respective patient community. And then once the protocol is, as I said, designed and clear, then comes the ethical review phase. And this I mentioned already. So the ethics committee is considering the benefit-risk balance, the fairness of inclusion and exclusion criteria, the suitability of the insurance conditions, the data protection measures, potential conflicts of interest of the investigators and their site staff, readability and acceptability of the informed consent documentation, avoidance of inducement, especially with vulnerable populations, that concerns also travel expense reimbursement and perhaps reimbursement of time spent by the participants, especially for the trial, and also how patient organizations can contribute to patient information altogether. And here we recommend that certainly patient experts are very well in a position to do that, but also patient organization representatives or patient advocates can be very valuable and helpful participants here for ethics committees, depending on what ethics committees are really expecting and wanting the patient engagement look like. And therefore, it's really something that the ethics committee needs to think about very carefully upfront, and I will talk about this also a bit later. Now, we have seen that sponsors sometimes involve patients in communication with trial participants after the end of the trial. This has so far been only very rarely the case, but as you probably know, at least those who are aware of the upcoming clinical trial regulation, there we will have a complete new activity, which is the lay summaries that the sponsor will have to prepare at the end, presenting the results of the trial, including the interpretation of the results to a lay community. And there, of course, it will also be very important to get the involvement of patients to make sure that the information that is provided fulfills this purpose. So we recommend that commercial and academic sponsors involve patient experts or patient organization representatives that are knowledgeable about living with a disease in the development of these lay summaries to ensure they are non-biased, suitable, and readable for patients. So I would like to make a stop here. We had big discussions about these recommendations about the type of people, of patients that we recommend for the different activities, and I could imagine that there are some differences of opinion also here in the audience.
I have a few more questions indeed. Somebody is asking if a woman is needed as patient expert in an ethical review group. Andrea?
I really don't have very much to say. Why should it be a woman? I don't see any difference here, really.
Giulio, do you want to comment?
Yeah, we are used in the HIV community to advocate for a fair representativeness of the sample population in clinical trials, a representation of the real life community of people living with HIV, with that disease. So this is something which is very important in general, although I think that in this case it can be really challenging. It can even be a barrier if you want to have a proper representation of the population in this process of patient involvement in ethical review. What is important here, as we said before, is that the patient representative should go beyond his own or her own experience and try to understand what's going on in the whole community. When I was referring earlier to the HIV prevention trial, which was very controversial, my attitude there was to get as much involved as I could in the discussion, so to hear all the position, all the different position, and also all the concerns raised by community members about this trial, and trying to summarize them and to bring them into the discussion with the trial sponsor and the ethical review. This is what we are supposed to do in this process, I think, trying to collect and to hear from our community or from the patient community in general all the contribution and to bring them into the discussion in the ethical review, more than advocating for what the personal participation of a woman, of a person from ethnical different origin, or whatever difference can be in the patient population. I hope this clarifies a bit.
Thank you, Giulio. Then I have another question. If we have statistics on how many patient representatives actually sit on ethics committees in how many countries. Ingrid, do you want to answer that?
Well, we have tried to gain an overview, and it's really difficult. Definitely no statistics that are in any way reliable, what we have so far, but I agree it would be an interesting task to try to do that. But we have countries, for example, like Germany, where there is a difference of opinion between the different ethics committees, whether there should be patients in there or not. So we have Länder in Germany where it is in the local legislation that a patient representative should be included, and in other Länder not at all. So within the countries we have different views in some countries. So we have, in other words, we have no comprehensive overview yet. It's obviously also a moving target because a lot of things are happening at the moment in that aspect.
Thank you, Ingrid. I have more questions, but for the sake of time, let's continue for the time being.
Okay, so the next aspect is about practical aspects of patient involvement in ethics committees. And principally what ethics committees told us are that there are two ways of engaging patients. On one hand, that could be full members of the patients could be full members of an ethics committee with equal rights and obligations as all other members. So to say, one other expert in the team. Or there are ethics committees that work with external peer reviewers that are called in, so to say, more or less regularly to give advice to the ethics committee members before their review meeting, so that they can go into the meeting with a better information, more informed. So the difference is that when you are a full member in an ethics committee, then you sit in the ethics committee and you are able to engage in the discussions and the weighing of the pros and cons. When you are an external peer reviewer, you give your opinion, and then this is carried into the ethics committee meeting, but you have no further possibility to impact the discussion about the clinical trial. So these are principal decisions that ethics committees have to make, or can make in most cases, how they are going to do that. Now, the other aspect that we really dealt quite a lot with was the patient's level of expertise. What are the pros and cons? What are the what is helpful? What is less helpful with these different patient categories? And we had, for example, in Spain, they have individual ethics committees who try out at the moment to engage patients, and there are a number of ethics committees who really want to have the individual patient, so really somebody who is naive in clinical research methodology, but knows how to live with a disease. When we discussed this in the workshop and in the webinar at the time, the topic or the key argument against that was that after some months, this naivety, so to say, of that patient disappears because they are not research naive anymore. And therefore, the question is then, for how long can this neutral, naive input be enabled before a new patient would have to be found and included then into the process. And others argued that the contribution of the research naive patients without experience, so if they have to argue, or if they are then asked to also help with discussions about diseases that are not their own, that in that case they are mostly or they are comparable at least with the input that laypersons are providing in ethics committees, which is anyway already the case, so there are already laypersons involved. This is a bit contradictory to what I said a bit earlier in this webinar, where I said the expertise of being a patient as such is already an expertise. The question is only then in how far is that particular expertise helpful in a particular project. So the input of individual patients or the involvement of individual patients has been seen by those who have commented as being quite particularly difficult. On the other hand, patient advocates, they have an in-depth knowledge of living with a disease from their own experience. And with each ethical review project that they are participating, they gain, of course, additional experience. But the question is the representativeness of their advice. How far is what they propose then is really representative for other patients with a disease? And in how far can an ethics committee feel comfortable that the advice that they get here is really that what other patients primarily think when they get asked about participation in a trial. Patient organization representatives, on the other hand, as I said, are patients either patients with a disease or patient organization members that are exposed to that community, to that environment. Now, the problem here is that patient organizations exist to support their members primarily and to lobby for their interests. So the question is, this lobbying activity, how will that impact then the neutrality of an ethics committee? And in how far is it then possible for these people to take their lobbying task back and to try really to give here the most neutral possible advice that can occur? And there is also in some ethics committees really a fear of having here lobbying activity and to deal with lobbying and lobbying of interest in the typical lobbying sense, which puts ethics committees into a difficult ethical dilemma, because on one hand they are there, of course, to support the patients and their interest, but on the other hand they need to defend their neutral view on the disease as well. So that can potentially lead to, at least perceived as being able to lead to conflicts if that is not very carefully handled, if there is not very clear agreement between the parties that the way in which they want to interact and how this collaboration should work. The last category, the patient experts, are patients with personal experience of living with a disease or the combined knowledge from working with members of their patient organizations. But in addition, they have this methodological experience that they gained either through a course or through the activities they did. They are primarily not joining the ethics committees in a ethics committee in a representative role, but have much exposure to other cases due their activities in their patient organization. So they have a quite big view as far as their patient organization is enabling that. and their contribution to ethical review of trials for other diseases could therefore also be valuable because of their knowledge of R&D seen from the patient's perspective. Therefore, we recommend in UParty that patient experts, patient advocates, or patient organization representatives knowledgeable about living with a disease in question should be involved in the work of research ethics committees, preferably as full members, to extend their input beyond development of the patient information sheet and informed consent form. So we really hope and would encourage ethics committees to see the role of patients beyond giving advice just on the patient information sheet and informed consent, but then to really thinking very clearly what the patient representative is expected to contribute and in what way to make it physically work, either as a full member or as an external advisor. I would like to stop here for a moment.
Yes, I have a question sitting here, an interesting one. How does the effort being involved in the ethical review pay out in the everyday life of a patient with a disease? Julio, that's one for you.
Yes, I think so. Well, talking from a very personal point of view, I think that being part of the ethics committee is one of the most rewarding and interesting experience I had, because this is something that is not related to my own experience itself, because I do not take part to clinical trials anymore, at least, but it is something that affects directly in a very effective way my community, the community of people living with the disease I am living with. So from a very personal point of view, it is really rewarding when you can see that your contribution is improving the participation of people living with that disease in the clinical trial, which means, of course, that we as community of people living with that disease are contributing either as ethical reviewers or as participants or as communicators also, because we also disseminate information about the clinical trials. In this effort, with these efforts, we are contributing to improve the health of our community, the quality of life of our community. We are helping in addressing all the needs, the health needs of our community. And this is really effective. It's something really real. You can see participation into the participants into the studies who are aware of the importance of their contribution, and also the community as a large understanding why it is important to be involved in the trial, to be informed in that trial, or just to be engaged into the discussion. So it is really an important part.
Thank you, Julio. The next question is, how would ethics committees find patients having the training to perform this kind of work?
That's for me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that is I think one of the most important and questions, because I think Ingrid is going to say something about that now. But the thing is, you have to have some kind of infrastructure, I think, where the ethics committee cannot go out actively and look for patients, because it also would not be able to decide which patient is really representative. So there would have been some infrastructure provided from the patient community, I think, in order to find the appropriate patients. And probably it would be good to have a pool of patients that you can get at, like we have ethics committee members. Let's say from oncology, we have 5 ethics committee members that can, according to whether they're available or not, jump in and judge a study. And so we would have to have a pool of patients where we can always come to, and therefore we will need the support of the patient community, I think. And this will get, must say, much more difficult when the clinical trial regulation comes, where we have very strict deadlines, there will be very little time to evaluate studies, and so it will be very crucial that we find a patient immediately that helps us evaluating the studies, because the timelines are very strict, and we have to have people ready. And there, of course, this question took me a bit by surprise before. If we have a pool of patient members of the ethics committees, there, of course, you will have to see that it's equally distributed between men and women, and equality. That's clear.
Thank you, Andrea. I suggest we continue.
Yeah, because that's, in fact, that is exactly now the topic of the next section of the guidance. This finding supportive patients, and also on the other hand then interested ethics committees. So how can patients find an ethics committee where they are able to contribute? And in fact, this matchmaking is not something that happens easily, and Andrea mentioned that already. This requires really preparation. Of course, involvement of a generic patient representative for reviews, trials for all kind of disease makes it easier for patients, members of ethics committees to find patient representatives. If they look for someone with a respective disease, then this could be, especially in a rare disease, become really difficult to find a suitable patient, and a patient with a disease and who is interested and knowledgeable enough to participate then in this review. So that means this requires preparation. And that is also really what we ultimately felt and heard from all the different ethics committees that we talked to, that there are different ways of preparing that systematically. So either ethics committee can establish collaboration and enable ethical review education opportunities with patient organizations, so that ethics committees offer to patient organizations that they go there, that they explain about clinical research, that they explain about ethical review, and raise interest in these patient organizations to support the work of ethics committees. That's of course laborsome, but it may be very rewarding, because first of all it increases the let's say the awareness about the important work of ethics committees in the patient community, and it's a very good basis for potential collaboration, which is certainly helpful if an ethics committee works, for example, more frequently in one area of diseases than in others. For these very big ethics committees that work on all type of indications, that's of course more difficult than to achieve. Some ethics committees propose advertisement, that they, when they are in such a pool building phase, that they advertise publicly that they are looking for patients who help them, who give advice, who participate in their work. Another possibility is, of course, the typical mouth by mouth or personal contact approach. That is one element how it could work. What ethics committees hope to get is more and more unsolicited applications from patients who are interested and who volunteer or propose their contribution to ethics committees. We discussed a lot about the development of matchmaking platforms. We had hoped that the last IMI project, not UPATI, but the one that was then proposed afterwards or offered afterwards, would give such an opportunity to develop such a platform. Unfortunately, that project was not awarded. So there is no international systematic approach to a matchmaking platform building at this stage, and therefore the proposal was to try to do that on a national basis, to develop national matchmaking platforms jointly between academic and commercial sponsors to facilitate collaboration with interested patients with different diseases and different levels of expertise. So we recommend that individual ethics committees develop a database of patients willing to join the ethical review process, and we encourage ethics committees to join forces to establish a joint database, for example, on national or regional level. We recommend that patient organizations create a database of members interested and educated in ethical review of clinical trials and patient organizations should communicate the existence of this database to the national ethics committees. Should we stop here for a moment?
I suggest that you continue because we have 15 minutes left.
Okay, good. Now, the next block of discussions that we had that were recommended to us to try to tackle is a delicate one, a difficult one, and I think it's not finally worked out in all aspects yet. And this is the conditions for patient involvement in ethics committees. First of all, there was a quite broad agreement that there should be, in fact, a written agreement, because also most ethics committees told us that they have also such a type of written agreement with their members from other disciplines. So the principal idea to have comparable conditions or the same conditions for patients as ethics committee members as all the others came up on and on and on. So if there is a written agreement with other ethics committee members from other disciplines, then there should also be one with the patient representative. And in fact, even if it's not the case that there is a written agreement with other ethics committee members, it was seen as really helpful to be forced, so to say, for both parties to develop the clarity about the collaboration and the conditions and the mutual expectations in this collaboration, because it's so unusual. There's so few experience that is out there. So preparing this through very clear thinking and communicating about the way of collaborating, and for such a process, a written agreement can be a very good facilitator, so to say. Another topic that was seen as extremely important is the topic of transparency. You are probably all aware about the discussions that patient organizations have with outside criticizing bodies or people that patient organizations are not objective, they are biased because they get money from pharma companies, from other organizations. So the issue of transparency is the only possibility to overcome, let's say, these hidden mistrust conditions. And first of all, this is a typical process anyway in ethics committees. Also, all the other members of an ethics committee need to regularly present their declaration of interest, not their declaration of conflict, but their declaration of interest. And we recommended in UPATI that this is, of course, also true for the patient participant in an ethics committee. But beyond that, we recommend that there is a voluntary declaration then also for the funding sources for the underlying patient organization, so that there cannot be any type of accusation of not being absolutely transparent. So it's not only the individual that should prepare this declaration of interest, but also the underlying patient organization that is the home of the patient representative in the ethics committee. The next topic is concerning the representativeness, because as I mentioned, in how far can patients trust their representative, so to say, in an ethics committee, that this person is able to really defend their interest in the most comprehensive way. And here we have really this problem that patient organizations are not prepared for that. Only a very limited number of patient organizations have started to systematically compile information about relevant aspects that play a role in the ethical review of a clinical trial in their area of indication. And patient organizations who decided on, so to say, their representative that is then suitably prepared for playing that representative role in an ethics committee. And therefore, our recommendation is that we recommend that patient organizations should really identify members interested in representing the organization in an ethics committee and ensure then that these members receive comprehensive information about the community's treatment needs, quality of life deficiencies, day-to-day life conditions, so all the things that this ethics committee member will then have to advise on. And we recommend that patient organizations implement a mechanism to exchange experience between their members that are then helpful for their representative in ethics committees, and to make sure that they are really, so to say, well armed. Of course, still keeping in mind and respecting these patient members' confidentiality obligations. The next point is about appointment, introduction, and training. We try to figure out with ethics committees in the different countries how they do that, how they prepare the patients for their role and their contribution in the ethics committee, and we got very different responses. Not many of them talked about a systematic approach. So it's really very important that that this is considered very carefully by the ethics committee how they are going to do that, and therefore we recommend that patient members receive a comprehensive introduction and appropriate continuous training independent of the frequency of their participation in the ethical review. Now, a lot of or most ethics committees give an introduction to new members in general. They have either a handbook or an introductory lecture or opportunity for introducing new members into the work of an ethics committee. And this should be also provided to patient representatives, perhaps with a special emphasis on the needs that these new members might have when joining the ethics committee. And there was also a discussion if these are members or patients that are only from time to time asked to join an ethics committee review, that they still should have the possibility to participate in such an introduction and training, and also updates that are provided to ethics committees or members on a regular basis should provided to the patient representatives, even if they are not regularly participating in the meetings. The next area that we try to talk about and to come up with a recommendation is the matter of compensation of money, which is always difficult when we talk about ethics, difficult when we talk about patient engagement in whatever function. When it comes to money, people become a bit more nervous and shy, and I know that there are currently quite heavy discussions ongoing also on the sponsor and patient interaction side to figure out how to do that in the most appropriate, fair, correct, and transparent way. So what the people who commented on that recommended ultimately, and where we thought in UParty that is also what we want to support here, is that there should be following considerations. Number one, the patient representatives should, like every other member of the ethics committee, be seen as someone who provides expertise and should not be expected to do that for free and for altruistic reasons, but to be compensated for their total time plus the expenses, like every other member of the ethics committee. That should be the compensation should be fair and appropriate for the type of engagement. Of course, if it's only from time to time, then it cannot be the same amount as someone who is regularly participating. Also, ideally, travel costs should be paid directly by the organizing partner and not so much through reimbursement, because that really means that the patients always have to first pay out of their own pocket and then at some stage get reimbursed, what might be for patients more difficult than for people having a job, working in the hospital, and having a regular salary. Also, covering the costs incurred by patient organizations when they help to identify or support patients for their involvement should then be taken into consideration, that these costs are covered if ever possible, because this is really a very important work of the patient organizations to increase the value that they can provide to this process for ethics committees. And it was also recommended to help with the logistics of the patient participation, including travel and or accommodation if necessary. So compensation also includes the indirect benefits in kind, like the patient organizations providing services free of charge of whatever type that has to be considered as a contribution in kind, and also other non-financial benefits provided to the patient organization, on the other hand, by the ethics committee, like training sessions, setting up of websites, etc. So all the things that ethics committees help patient organizations should be taken up in that equation. So we thought that this is really important, that people are aware of what the issues are, what the conditions are, what the needs are, and then find individually a fair and transparent solution for that patient interaction. So I think that is as far as our guidance tried to come up concretely with recommendations. These are, of course, still relatively vague, but hopefully this guidance is able then to give at least a clear idea on the topics that the partners should think about, and to some degree recommendations what we think would be the most appropriate approach to make this a successful, rapid growth in interaction. So
Thank you very much, Ingrid. I have two more questions to the panelists. The first one to Andrea. When did you miss a patient presence most in your career in ethical review, in an ethical review? Can you remember such an occasion?
Well, I would say, like I mentioned before, when there are really those painful times when you have to reject a clinical trial, and it's most painful when this is a multi-center clinical trial where then our site has to opt out. There's always a lot of discussion going on, of course, before something like that, and it would be extremely beneficial, I think, for the ethics committee to have also a very convincing patient side to argue their decision. And the other thing where we really would need patient input very much is the topic of the informed consent forms. That's a very sad topic. That's still the quality of these forms are not very, very unsatisfactory usually, and there would be a lot of work to be done, but that probably should actually happen before the document reaches the ethics committee.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and especially the point about the informed consent forms. I couldn't agree more. Now a question to Giulio. What was the most challenging moment for you being on the ethics committee in Italy?
Interesting question. It is not an easy one. I think that all the procedures related to these controversial trials were one of the occasions where I found it more difficult to represent the patient community. Yeah, in any case, when it is about representing a diverse community and trying to summarize different points of view and to bring together different approaches to the topic, to the research, and to the procedures, and this is really challenging. In my role as patient representatives, there have been also some smaller challenges in trying to get my voice heard properly within the discussion. Somehow we as patient representatives are considered some kind of troublemakers usually, because we always try to view things from a different point of view, from a different perspective, and this is not easy. I perfectly understand it is not always easy to be for people coming from a medical point of view, for example, to accept this different perspective, which can be really different. For some scientists, some theoretical risks can be really important, while for us as people living the real life, what is theoretical is much less important than what we experience in our daily life, and this is sometimes very difficult.
Thank you very much, Giulio. We are coming to the end of this webinar. I would like to remind the participants about the next two topics. Next webinar will be Tuesday, June 20, on involvement in regulatory affairs, and the last one, number 4, will be Wednesday, July 5, on involvement in health technology assessment bodies. I would like to thank the presenter Ingrid Klingmann and the two panelists Andrea Heckenberg and Giulio Maria Corbelli, and the participants for the many questions. I also would like to apologize. I couldn't get all the questions replied. I hope I picked the most pertinent ones, and I wish everybody a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.